The mountain was silent, and the sky clear, while below the city stirred, not in fear, but in the rhythm of life. Pompeii, ancient and breathing, where sandals brushed stone, where laughter echoed through painted walls, where incense curled toward gods carved in marble. They sang, they feasted, they dreamed beneath a sleeping giant they did not fear. But deep below, the earth had already begun to shift, and above, Vesuvius inhaled. Tonight, you'll walk through that memory, not as a stranger, but as a soul passing gently through time, through gardens and forums, through taverns and temples, through lives once lived. Let the world around you dim, let the hush settle in, and feel the breath of history, slow and deep, as Pompeii's last day rises, like mist around you. Close your eyes, now. The story begins. In the hush before dawn, when the Bay of Naples still held the night's final breath, and the world lingered in that soft, uncertain space between dreams and awakening, the city of Pompeii stirred beneath the looming silhouette of Mount Vesuvius, a titan cloaked in silence, whose ancient breath warmed the vineyards and olive groves sprawling across its slopes like offerings to a sleeping god. The streets, paved in basalt and thyme, shimmered faintly with dew as early risers, vendors, slaves, bakers, and priests opened shutters and doorways, shaking off the night with the familiar rhythm of routine that had thrived for centuries within those walls. Birds chirped from fig trees inside courtyard gardens. The coo of doves echoed beneath porticos, and the scent of fresh bread rose from communal ovens as the city, Roman in name, Greek in memory, Oscan in origin, came to life with the serene arrogance of a place that believed the world would never change. Beneath the tiled rooftops and painted frescoes, life moved in patterns worn smooth by generations. Children chased each other across the paving stones, laughing as their sandals slapped against time-worn roads. Magistrates and freedmen gathered in the forum to murmur politics and commerce beneath the shadow of marble temples dedicated to gods. Women bartered for fabrics in the shade of cloth canopies, their voices rising like birdsong over the calls of merchants hawking fish, fruit, wine, and dreams in the open air. From the House of the Faun to the suburban baths, from the brothels with their painted walls to the sacred grove of Venus, in memory and always above, watching but silent, was the mountain not feared, not questioned, merely accepted as eternal as the stars, as unmoving as fate itself. Its slopes were dotted with vineyards and shepherds' trails, its crater hidden by clouds and indifference. And though the earth beneath sometimes whispered with tremors, the people no longer listened. They had heard worse and survived, had rebuilt after the great quake of 62 AD, and convinced themselves that nature's fury had been appeased by time and marble. In the grand villa of Marcus Tullius Stephanus, a former slave who had risen to prominence through shrewd business and political cunning, musicians tuned their lyres and cooks prepared a feast to celebrate a new statue. Across the city, in the modest home of a widowed teacher named Albinia, ink-stained fingers copied verses of Virgil by lamplight, while her daughter Livia, in the temple of Jupiter, acolytes swept ash from the altar and trimmed the wicks of oil lamps, unaware that the sky they worshipped would soon fall upon them. In the garden of a tavern near the gate of Herculaneum, a gladiator named Drusus, his face weathered by battles both public and personal, kissed the scarred hand of a healer who had once stitched his chest, in rhythm with the mountain that watched and waited, and far beneath the soil, where magma twisted and stone groaned, the clock had begun to count down, not with bells or proclamations, but with pressure building in silence, with fire seeking air. The day would come when the sky would darken and the earth would scream, but in that final dawn, Pompeii was alive, more alive than it had ever been, glittering in its own myth, unaware that its final heartbeat had already begun. And as the sun climbed higher, spilling golden warmth over terracotta rooftops and waking the white doves perched along Corinthian columns, artisans unlatched their shop fronts to reveal shelves of mosaics and metalwork, and the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer echoed like a heartbeat through the stone arteries of Pompeii's ancient streets, each strike a testament to the enduring belief that life would always continue, just as it had the day before. In the Forum, gossip crackled like dry leaves in the air. Senator Cassius was rumored to be feuding with the aedile over grain shipments, beneath the gaze of passing merchants who whispered behind their hands. A wine merchant named Publius poured the morning's first cup for an aging philosopher, a handful of bees from a clay jar, watching them vanish into the lavender that grew beside the statue of Mercury. In the theater district, actors rehearsed under the colonnades of the Quadriporticus, their exaggerated voices drifting over the mosaic-tiled courtyards. Sweating through his linen tunic, cursed the weather and the actors alike as he rewrote the final lines of a play no one would ever see performed. Just beyond the city walls, farmers tended to fig trees and herded goats across sun-drenched pastures. Young soldiers trained beneath the watchful eyes of veterans scarred from campaigns in Dacia and Parthia, their shields clashing like thunder against the hardened dust of the yard. And in a narrow alley behind the temple of Isis, a boy named Lucius, barefoot and curious, lifted a broken shard of painted pottery from the ground, turning it over in his hands as if it might tell him something of the past or warn him of the future, not knowing that in time his own bones would be found curled beside that very piece, sealed in the silence of ash. Life in Pompeii was not grand in every moment, but it was full, rich with small dramas, with moments of beauty and hunger and pettiness and love, with meals prepared by women humming old songs, with oil lamps flickering over sleeping children, with prayers whispered to gods who had long stopped answering. Every breath of the city, every whispered joke and clattering cart and kiss stolen in a darkened archway, was part of a living tapestry, now tightening toward its final knot. And still the mountain stood unchanged, unreadable, looming like a sentinel of time itself. Smoke sometimes rose faintly from its peak, mistaken for morning mist, and when the ground shifted beneath foot, they called it the gods stretching in their sleep. They had survived worse, they believed. They had rebuilt after disaster. They were Romans. They were pumped like fire. The memory touched the dead, and the stone echoed with grief. No one spoke of fear, for death was always a companion in Rome, something acknowledged and ritualized, not avoided and certainly not expected to come from the sky. In the suburban baths, where the walls whispered erotic myths in paint and steam curled through marbled chambers, a young soldier named Tertius swam beneath a domed ceiling lit with shafts of sunlight, unaware that the same waters would boil. When the fires came, children fed scraps to stray dogs near the bakery of Modestus, where bread blistered in clay ovens and the smell of flour and fire hung heavy in the air. A scribe named Callias reclined beneath an awning, composing a letter on wax tablets about a dream he'd had of crows flying backward, of stone bleeding, of voices lost in fog which he dismissed with a chuckle before sealing it and sending it north with a courier. Pompeii was not watching the mountain. Pompeii was watching itself, in love with its own reflection, its own theater of life, its gods and gossip, its rhythms and rituals, convinced that if the world ever ended, it would send word, first in writing, in lightning, in something grand, not in the silence that now pulsed beneath their feet. And yet the signs were there, if one listened closely: wine jars that cracked for no reason, water that tasted faintly of sulfur, the restless shifting of birds that refused to nest. In a darkened room near the city gate, an augur read omens in the entrails of a sacrificed ram and paused, disturbed by the shape of the liver, but said nothing better to keep the coin and let the gods explain themselves later. The earth stirred again, faintly, like something turning in sleep, and still the city thrived, clothed in illusion, radiant in ignorance, rage, but in stunned, open-mouthed awe as the sky cracked and history came down as ash. The first tremor did not announce itself with thunder or flame, but with a silence so deep it felt unnatural, as though the very breath of the earth had paused in its lungs, and only those who listened with the stillness of animals could hear the shift beneath the surface, a low and distant grumble that slid beneath the noise of the living city like a secret too ancient to name. In the pale blush of morning, while the dew still clung to the grapevines outside the city, and fishermen cast their nets into the bay with hopeful murmurs, the first warning passed unnoticed, cloaked in the familiar a pitcher, shuddering slightly. On a shelf, a tile cracking faintly in a villa courtyard, the startled cries of birds taking sudden flight across a still sky. In the house of Caecilius, a matron dropped a silver mirror and watched it spin on the floor, her reflection warping with every turn before it finally lay still. In the nearby barracks, a soldier cursed as his polished helmet rolled from its stand and clanged to the stone with a clang like distant thunder. And far from the bustle of the inner city, an old goatherd named Naso, who had lived his entire life in the shadow of Vesuvius, paused mid-step on the slope as a breeze he could not feel passed through the hair on his arms, and the ground whispered something beneath his feet. "Not today," he muttered, rubbing his knees, "not again." Thinking of the great quake 17 years ago, when statues fell and temples cracked and Pompeii staggered but stood, that memory still lingered in the stones of the city, in the repaired columns, the half-finished frescoes, the scaffolding that clung to public buildings like ivy of industry. They had survived before. They would again. But on this morning, there was something different in the light. The sun seemed slower to rise, casting a honeyed hue across the forum that dulled the marble and gilded the shadows. Priests at the temple of Jupiter fumbled incense onto the coals, their chants stumbling as a second tremor passed, stronger, quicker, gone in an instant, but enough to send birds from the rooftops and draw uneasy eyes toward the slumbering mountain. It was not yet panic, not yet even fear, but an unease was blooming beneath the confidence of routine. In the bakery of Calvus, flour spilled like snow, when a shelf swayed, and the young apprentice cried out as clay jugs cracked at his feet. His master, grizzled and toothless, waved it off with a grunt. The mountain clears its throat. That's all. Go fetch more flour. In the house of Livia, the noblewoman who dined with senators and financed poets, a servant girl named Marcia swept fallen fig leaves from the courtyard when the third tremor came, and the broom slipped from her fingers. The gods, she whispered, crossing herself in the old way, and was slapped for her foolishness. But the tremors continued, subtle and inconsistent, enough to be felt but not feared, enough to inspire murmurs in the bathhouses and questions in the markets, but not enough to cancel plays or silence liars. In the forum, a philosopher argued with a merchant about portents, quoting Lucretius on the nature of fire and stone, while around them people paused only briefly before resuming their lives, chalking the unrest up to nature's whims, to the pressure of weather, to the whims of Vulcan or the mischief of Faunus. Children still played. Lovers still lingered beneath archways. Wine still flowed in the taverns. But those who had lived long in the city, those who remembered the way the sky had turned yellow once before, the way the birds had vanished, the way the air had smelled just before the great quake, they grew quiet, they listened, they watched the peak. They noticed when the doves refused to return to their roosts, when the dogs growled at nothing, when the fountains sputtered and the fish in the fountains floated belly up. In the temple district, cracks appeared not only in the stone, but in the confidence of the priests, who began offering sacrifices with trembling hands, even as they told the people all was well. And in the small alley behind the baths, an old woman named Albania, who read fortunes from oil bowls, lit one candle too many that night and refused to sleep, her eyes fixed on the stars, which no longer moved in the patterns she had charted for decades. Still, the city persisted. Rome had taught them pride, the gods had taught them obedience, and the mountain silent and dark had always taught them forgetfulness. But something was waking now beneath its skin, something deep and molten and cruel, and it did not care for prayers or poems or the names of noblemen carved in stone. It cared only for release, by the second day. The tremors had taken on a rhythm, a cruel kind of heartbeat, pulsing beneath the cobbled streets and marble walls, steady and patient, like the footsteps of something approaching that no one could see, but that every living creature could feel in its bones. Dogs refused to enter doorways. Oxen turned their heads toward the mountain with wet, rolling eyes, and birds, once so numerous in the skies above Pompeii, had all but vanished, their nests abandoned, their songs silenced by the deeper music of the earth, a slow and grinding chorus of stress and pressure and ancient fire clawing its way to the surface. In the baths, where men once laughed naked in clouds of fragrant steam, the water began to smell sour, the drains gurgled like choking throats, and the painted ceilings shivered with every soft quake that passed through the foundations. In the House of the Faun, a mosaic tile depicting Alexander the Great cracked clean across the king's face, and no one could agree whether it was an omen or coincidence. Julia Secunda, widow of a wealthy olive merchant and devout in her offerings to the household Lares, insisted her servants sleep in the open courtyard after the ceiling above the triclinium groaned and shifted with a sound like bending wood. Along the Via dell'Abbondanza, merchants packed their stalls more cautiously, and amphorae of wine were stacked with increasing care. Yet no one dared speak of leaving not yet, for what roaming abandoned his home on the whisper of a quake. They called it nervousness. They called it the heat. They whispered about divine punishment, about forgotten rituals, about the wrath of the gods. But louder still was the voice of pride that insisted they had survived worse, that Pompeii was eternal, that the gods might tremble, but Rome did not retreat. And yet, far from the city walls, the mountain itself had begun to change. Thin trails of smoke rose from unseen vents in the forest, curling like ghostly fingers between branches where no fire had touched. And shepherds began to lose livestock, found dead without wound or sound, eyes wide, mouths open, as though gasping for something that had already been taken. In the villa of Gnaeus Valerius, an amateur scholar of natural philosophy, scrolls of Pliny the Elder lay unfurled beside sketches of the mountain's shape, and his ink-stained fingers trembled as he wrote of thermal waters turning foul and insects disappearing overnight. Nature recoils, he whispered, though no one listened. His wife wept in secret, clutching her newborn clothes, while the family prepared for a birthday feast in which guests would raise cups and speak of gods who watched from distant stars, blind to the furnace beneath their feet. And still the city carried on. In the Forum, laws were read, disputes were settled. In the Odeon, actors rehearsed a new comedy, their voices echoing strangely in a hall where no laughter came. In the villa of Octavia Felix, a freedwoman turned poet, dinner was served in golden bowls as she recited verses about love enduring beyond death. Never knowing her own name, would one day be found etched into plaster beside the silhouette of her bones. The signs grew louder, flowed strangely in fountains. The air stung faintly of sulfur, and in the port at Herculaneum, sailors spoke of a red sheen that shimmered across the sea at night, like blood skimming the surface of moonlight. But no orders came from Rome. No augury proclaimed the city cursed, and so the baker baked. The banker lent coin. The whores whispered in darkened rooms, and the priests, those few who still believed the gods were listening, burned incense thicker each hour, trying to mask the scent of fear. It was the silence that followed the tremors that frightened them most, a heavy stillness, broken only by the clatter of dishes or the sudden scream of a frightened animal, and always that uneasy, unanswered question: where had the birds gone? And why was the mountain so quiet now when it had stirred so much before? Nearby, a girl named Amelia stood in the garden of her home, holding her brother's hand, watching the birds continue not to return. And when she asked why the sky seemed darker, though no clouds hung there, her brother said only, "I don't know," and squeezed her hand tighter. That evening, a sulphurous haze drifted through the city, light and almost sweet at first, mistaken by some for the distant perfume of jasmine. But those who inhaled deeply coughed harder than they ever had, and the old healer Ennius, who had once treated wounds in Germania, closed his shutters and ground bitter herbs into a paste he did not explain. "Tomorrow," he said to his wife, "we leave." But most did not. Most could not. Their lives were here. Their gods were here. Their dead were buried in these walls. And so, as the stars emerged behind a veil of dust that had no wind to carry it, Pompeii laid its head down one final time in uneasy dreams, not knowing that the mountain above had finished its waiting. that beneath its ancient crown a throat of stone had opened, that magma had breached its prison of rock, and that, in the morning, with a force not seen in living memory, it would speak not in words, but in fire. It began not with fire nor fury, but with a sound, deep and inhuman, like the grinding of a giant wheel beneath the earth's crust, a roar so low it made amphorae hum and bones ache, a bass note of destruction vibrating through the core of every living thing in Pompeii, and in that instant, every heart knew that the mountain had awakened not as a god, but as a monster. At precisely the 6th hour, the ground convulsed, not as it had in the days before, not as a tremor, not as a warning, but as a scream, and the city shuddered, as though being shaken from the heavens themselves. Roof tiles rained like hailstones. Statues split along divine brows, and in the baths, columns cracked in half and fell like thunder, crushing those who still soaked in denial. In the Villa of the Mysteries, frescoes that had survived generations peeled in a single moment as walls moaned and buckled. From the summit of Vesuvius, a column of black fire surged skyward with a shriekish's stone, gas, molten fragments, the very breath of the underworld, thrown aloft in a pillar that reached for the gods and darkened the noon sky into twilight. It was not like a storm, nor like Waret, was something older, more elemental, something primal, as though the earth itself had remembered pain and decided to show it. The air grew hot, not like summer, but like a forge, sharp with sulfur, laced with dust that bit the lungs and blinded the eyes. People screamed not from injury, but from knowing. They ran from homes that had been standing for centuries, barefoot on stones, suddenly too hot to touch, clutching children, icons, jewelry, bread, anything that meant something before it could mean nothing. In the Forum, a magistrate named Publius tried to calm the crowd, raising his voice in the name of order. But his words were lost beneath the roar and the endless drumbeat of falling debris. He vanished into the crush of bodies and never re-emerged. Overhead, the ash cloud climbed and twisted into a black plume shaped like a pine tree, thickening into an umbrella of death that flattened the sky and cast the first stone scoria and pumice, raining like the wrath of forgotten gods. They fell lightly, at first tink-tink, tink striking rooftops and heads with the gentleness of pebbles. But then they thickened, intensified, became fists of stone thrown by the sky itself. In the house of the silver wedding, a nursemaid tried to shield her charge with a woven basket, but the roof collapsed in, crushing them both in a heartbeat. In the temple of Venus, worshippers cried and clung to the altar, until the dome caved, and marble and bodies mingled in silence. And still the mountain roared, sending wave after wave of ash and stone into the wind, carried south and west, burying vineyards, breaking ships in harbor, coating olive trees in gray blankets of smothering dust. Animals screamed and bolted into the sea, horses reared and tore their reins. Dogs howled and refused to move from doorways, choosing to die at thresholds they had known since birth. The sun disappeared completely by the 8th hour. Torches flickered to life as if night had fallen, though it was still day, and by now the ash was knee-deep in the streets, hot to the touch and growing deeper by the minute, choking alleys, collapsing awnings, dragging wagons into paralysis. In the bakery of Fabius, the oven still glowed, abandoned, the dough inside never to rise again. The baker's skeleton would later be found just feet away, his arms filled with coins, as though he thought money could shield him from fire. Near the theater, a woman named Tirsha fled barefoot, her child strapped to her back, eyes wide with terror, until she slipped in the ash and vanished beneath a falling wall. In the countryside, those who had fled early looked back to see the plume stretching across the sky, darkening their fields, blotting out the world like a curtain. Yet still some stayed, many could not leave, some would not. Marcus Tullius Stephanus stood at the gate of his villa, watching the city die, unwilling to abandon the legacy he had built with Roman pride. Even as pumice fell like hailstones onto his shoulders, he died standing, face turned upward, body frozen in dignity. As the day turned blacker, as the thunder of stone grew louder, as the tremors returned with ever greater violence, people began to dig, frantic, useless, desperate. They tried to uncover buried doorways, push carts through chest-high ash, seek shelter beneath lintels and arches. They buried their faces in cloth. They screamed for their gods. They prayed for rain. But there was no rain. There was no wind. There was only the heat, the ash, and the deepening blackness of a sky that had forgotten how to shine. By the 9th hour, Pompeii had become a labyrinth of choking ash, collapsing roofs, and screams that died in soot-thick Aeron. Entire city staggering beneath the weight of its own undoing. Every alleyway a grave in waiting, every breath drawn through rags and tunics, a gamble against suffocation, as pumice stones the size of apples now hurled downward in a storm with no end, each one cracking tile and skull alike, with a sound like pottery smashing in the hands of angry gods. The people, so proud only days before, now crawled through their streets, on hands and knees, faces blackened, voices hoarse, searching for doorways that no longer existed, for family members lost in the gray veil that blurred even the familiar. Into shadowy ghost sat the temple of Apollo. A priestess named Livia wept as she fed the sacred flame with strips torn from her own gown, whispering pleas to a sky that had ceased to listen, her arms streaked with blood and soot as the tremors sent columns crashing down around her. In a tavern near the Porta Nocera, 5 men huddled with wine jugs clutched to their chests like relics, silent and wide-eyed, their laughter long dried into ashland silence. When the beam overhead finally cracked, they barely blinked, too numb to move. Further down the street, a young couple, Marcus and Ilia, newly married only weeks before, tried to escape through the garden gate of their family domus, only to find the ash had sealed it shut like a tomb, and so they wrapped themselves in each other, huddled in the peristyle as the house groaned and the mountain boomed above them. A chorus of death drumming through the world like the heartbeat of the apocalypse. In the marketplace, statues of Mercury and Fortuna toppled as stalls ignited in spontaneous flame embers, carried in the heat and lightning that crackled at the edge of the volcanic plume, where fire met storm and the air itself twisted into madness. Merchants tried to dig through their stalls to reach coin or goods, but their hands blistered and bled, and the market that had once sung with color and clamor now moaned like a field of the dying. In one villa, a grandfather lay against the atrium wall, shielding 3 grandchildren beneath his cloak as ash fell through the imploding ceiling. Like snow he spoke, not of fear, but of stories, whispering the names of constellations that no longer shone overhead, trying to give them something beautiful to hear in their last hour. Meanwhile, in the port of Stabia, Pliny, the elder, arrived by boat. Determined to rescue friends and study the phenomenon, he wrote, he observed. He gasped at the black curtain and the sulphurous gusts that bent the sails like leaves, but even his courage faltered when the heat grew unbearable, and men collapsed without warning beside him, their bodies blackened, not by fire, but by poisoned wind. Back in Pompeii, by the 10th hour, the city no longer resembled a place, had become a shape in the ash, its walls blurred, its statues broken, its courtyards sunken under feet of smoldering gray. And above it all, the mountain screamed again. Another explosion tearing skyward as the column collapsed in on itself, unleashing pyroclastic surges that hurtled down the slopes with the speed of nightmares. These were not flames that danced, but clouds of stone and death, hotter than any fire known to man, swallowing villas and vineyards in seconds, leaving behind only silence and shadow. Yet Pompeii did not die all at once. It clung to life in stubborn pockets, in cellars where families huddled with their gods, in stairwells where lovers gripped one another's ash-dusted faces, in bathhouses where steam was now replaced by searing gas. And through it all, the mountain gave no rest, no mercy, only wave after wave of stone and dust and molten rage, until the air itself became a grave. And Pompeii, the living city, was no more. And then it was over, not with a roar, but with silence, thick and absolute, as the final surge of fire and ash settled over the bones of a city that no longer breathed, burying Pompeii in a final blanket of gray that smoothed every jagged ruin, stilled every outstretched hand, and froze every final breath mid-motion. The mountain, having exhaled its fury, now stood mute and smoking, the black plume thinning into the sky like a wound retreating beneath a scab, while below, the once vibrant streets lay sealed in time frescoes, preserved in color, bred still in ovens, tables set for meals that would never come, lovers entwined in eternal embrace, faces twisted in final awe or agony. All was still. No birds sang, no footsteps echoed, only the wind moved across the ashen crust where life had once thrived. And so Pompeii became a tomb, not of death, but of memory. Its silence, louder than its cries, its stillness more enduring than its life, waiting beneath centuries of soil and stone to be rediscovered, not just by the shovels of archaeologists, but by the dreams of all who would one day listen to the ghost of that sky that fell, and the city it took with it. When the earth finally grew still, and the sky slowly brightened from soot-darkened black to a sickly gray-blue haze, the world that had once been Pompeii lay beneath a crust of hardened ash and silence so complete it felt like the gods had turned their faces away, as if shameful of the destruction wrought. No voices rose, no doors creaked open, no footsteps disturbed the dust that blanketed every stone and street and soul. It was as if time itself had been sealed alongside the dead, buried in the heat and horror of that final day, entombed not just in earth, but in silence, myth, and forgetting. Above the gray landscape, Vesuvius stood, altered, its crown blown away. Villas, the forums, the markets, the theaters, all were flattened or sunken. shapes vaguely remembered beneath layers of ash-like memories, beneath old grief. What had once been color and motion, laughter and song, was now shadow and stone. The city's veins stilled mid-beat. In the countryside, survivors wandered numb through olive groves dusted in ash, calling names no longer answered, hoping against all hope to find kin who had fled in time, but the roads were gone, the milestones buried, the fields swallowed. Farmers who had once tilled the fertile volcanic soil now stood barefoot, clutching rosaries or relics, unable to understand how a place so full of life could vanish so completely. In the port of Stabia, sailors whispered of what they had seen: black tower rising from the sea, lightning dancing through smoke, whole streets swallowed whole land, though they did not yet know the name of pyroclastic flow or volcanic winter. They knew they had witnessed something divine and damning, something that tore the veil between earth and sky. Pliny the Younger, safe across the bay, wrote down his account with a scholar's hand and a grieving heart, capturing not just the facts, but the feeling, that sense of helpless awe before nature's fury, the bewilderment of watching civilization collapse in an afternoon. And yet, even as the ash cooled and hardened, the world around Pompeii did what it always had moved on. Rome did not fall, the empire did not tremble. A new emperor took the throne. Gladiators still fought, senators still schemed. Time, that most ruthless of gods, continued its march. And Pompeii, once so full of pride, of murals and myths and living breaths, lipped into legend, a name spoken with sorrow by a few, a cautionary tale by others, a whisper that faded year by year into dust, just like the city itself. But beneath that dust, the city remained, not destroyed, but preserved a still life of a world halted in motion, waiting not for resurrection, but rediscovery. Years passed, then decades, and POMPEII faded from maps and minds. A ghost city without a grave, its name whispered only by shepherds who feared the mountains' sleeping bulk, or by fishermen who claimed to hear voices on still nights when the wind blew inland, calling from the ground, muffled by centuries of ash. The land slowly reclaimed what the gods had silenced: vines tangled over forgotten walls, olive trees rooted themselves into the remnants of atriums, and flocks grazed where senators once strolled until even the outlines of streets were blurred into nature's forgetting. But the mountain did not sleep peacefully. Steam vensened, those who lived in its shadow learned to fear without understanding, passing down only fragments of memory, stories of a once beautiful city swallowed whole in a single day, cursed by the gods or punished for decadence, depending on the teller. Rome itself never returned to rebuild. The empire turned eastward, then fractured, and as centuries folded over themselves, what remained of Pompeii fell under layer after layer of earth and myth, like a wound the world had chosen to forget. But not all memories stay buried. In the 16th century, an architect digging a canal near the town of Tor Annunziata uncovered strange stones inscriptions, walls, mosaics, but lacking context, they were dismissed. It wasn't until the mid-1700s, under the reign of Charles III of Naples, that serious excavations began, and the breath of Pompeii stirred again. As shovels bit into the earth, they revealed walls that had not seen light in almost 2,000 years, rooms frozen in time, staircases still covered in soot, frescoes bursting with untouched color. The first archaeologists, though more grave robbers than scientists, dug with awe and greed, unearthing sculptures, coins, and paintings, shipping them to royal collections, while the dust of the dead clung to their clothes. But for every artifact stolen, something eternal was awakened. The voices of the past, held in the grip of ash and silence, began to speak. Whole villas emerged with painted gods still smiling, kitchens still stocked, skeletons still curled in corners where hope had died. A baker's oven still held loaves of bread, scorched and round. A mother's hand still clutched a child's arm. Even graffiti returned to light crude jokes. It was not majestic like Rome, nor mystic like Alexandria. Was human. The world saw in Pompeii not just tragedy, but recognition. These were not mythic figures, but bakers and children, lovers and thieves. Their final moments were ordinary, and in that ordinariness they became eternal. Asmore of POMPEII, I was revealed, piece by piece. The city emerged like a photograph developing in reverse from a smear of soil and rubble to the precise geometry of Roman life, and suddenly the world realized it had not just found a ruin, but a heartbeat trapped in volcanic amber. And so, artists and philosophers, emperors and tourists alike, came to walk its streets, not to mourn, but to marvel, among them Goethe, who wept at the murals, Dickens, who wrote of its strange, unearthly preservation, and legions of scholars, who pored over every wall, every shard of pottery, as if each fragment might whisper some long-held secret. The plaster casts came next, bones left hollows in the ash, and careful hands filled them with liquid plaster, revealing human shapes in their final postures, some crouched in prayer, some shielding children, one covering his face as if to hold back time itself. These casts, these ash mummies, became the silent chorus of Pompeii's memory, and in them the living saw reflections, not of strangers, but of themselves, mothers, lovers, workers, people caught in the machinery of fate. It was not just the drama of their death that haunted visitors, it was their life. With every unearthed wine shop or kitchen hearth, archaeologists realized they were not just reconstructing a city, they were resurrecting a world, one so intimate and immediate that even centuries could not quiet its voice. And in the crumbling frescoes, where gods still danced and mortals feasted, there was a beauty unmarred by time. Children's toys were found beneath beds, tools were left mid-repair, scrolls turned to stone sat in libraries, still echoing with lost wisdom. Even the brothels, with their faded erotic frescoes, offered insight into a city without censorship, alive in its pleasures and shameless in its appetites. The more the city was unearthed, the more it felt like Pompeii was not just a relic of history, it was a message from it, a warning, a whisper, a reminder that no matter how mighty the empire, how refined the artistry, how full the amphory, and how loud the laughter, all of it could vanish in a breath. And yet, in that vanishing, a strange kind of permanence took root, because, in their destruction, the Pompeians had become immortal, not through power, but through preservation, not by conquering others, but by being conquered by the earth itself. And so, generation after generation came to walk their streets, to trace fingers along walls where hands once smoothed plaster, to stand in forums where voices once rose like birds. And in doing so, they did not just remember POMPEI'S, they kept it alive, and so. Pompeii endures, not just in stone and ash, but in the hearts of all who have walked its silent streets and felt the weight of voices long buried, now whispering. Through frescoes, through alleyways, through the frozen gestures of those caught mid. It is no longer simply a city that fell, but a place that speaks a testament not only to catastrophe, but to continuity, a reminder that beauty can be buried, yet not broken, that memory can smolder beneath centuries and still rise, luminous and defiant from the dust. In the hush of the ruins, as the sun slants through shattered colonnades and wildflowers bloom where blood once spilled, time softens, blurs, and circles back, and Pompeii becomes less a relic and more a reflection of fragility, of wonder, of the brief, bright flicker of human life. They came not with swords or scrolls, but with curiosity and dust-covered boots, men and women from distant lands and distant centuries, drawn by whispers that something ancient stirred beneath the vineyards of Campania, something not dead, but waiting. And in the late 1700s, as the Enlightenment bloomed across Europe like a cold, rational sunrise, a different kind of light flickered on the buried bones of Pompeii, flickered in the form of lanterns lowered into broken crypts, in gasps echoing through shattered archways, in the moment when the shovel struck painted stone and history gasped its first breath in 1,000 years. And though their names have been weathered by time, Rock, Joaquin de Alcubierre, Carl Weber, Francesco La Vega, their hands were the ones that peeled back the skin of time to reveal what ash had hidden, and yet they were not the first to hear the voice of the dead city. For even before the formal digs, even before Charles III declared it property of the crown, local peasants had stumbled upon frescoes while tilling the soil, their hoes striking marble faces, their sons plundering coin-stuffed urns by moonlight, the sacred and profane bleeding into one another, with each uncovered treasure. But it was the artists and poets, the dreamers, who truly saw Pompeii, who felt its breath curling between columns, who listened not for gold, but for ghosts. And among them was a young man named Luca, apprenticed to a Neapolitan fresco restorer, whose first glimpse of the city came not in daylight, but in the glow of torchlight deep within the temple of Venus, where he paused, brush in hand, eyes wide, before the unveiled image of the goddess, her figure half shattered, yet smiling. And in that smile he felt not beauty, but invitation, as though she were whispering secrets through plaster and ruin. And from that day forward, Luca returned again and again, sketching faces not for restoration, but for remembrance, capturing not perfection, but the fracture, the wound, the ache, of a city that had dreamed and died. Past Larea, covered in dust and mosaics, chipped by time, Luca invented names for the figures caught mid-motion, a woman reaching for her child, frozen in plaster. He called her Marcia, a man shielding his dog with his body. He named Titus, a child curled beneath a stairwell. He called Pox, and to him they were not exhibits, not curiosities, but stories cut short, prayers turned to silence. And he kept a journal where he wrote each day's encounter like a scripture. Today Marcia wept, for her fresco has begun to peel, or Pox remains quiet. But the ivy creeps closer to his wall. Perhaps it will shelter him again. Some called him mad, a romantic, obsessed with shadows, but others followed inspired by his reverence. And so the cult of Pompeii, not a cult of faith, but of memory, began to grow. Drawing writers and artists from across Europe, Goethe walked the ruined streets and claimed to hear music. Mary Shelley sat before a skeleton and wept. Dickens wandered the amphitheater and wrote of dust heavier than grief. And as the years passed, Pompeii did not vanish into museum halls, but became a mirror held up to every century that gazed into its face, reflecting not just how Romans lived and died, but how the living understood their own fragility. In the 1800s, Queen Caroline of Naples held elaborate feasts beside the ruins, where guests in togas danced over the very streets where ash had once rained down like divine wrath. And as they laughed, archaeologists toiled quietly nearby, brushing bones clean, uncovering bedrooms where lovers had turned to stone in each other's arms. And always, always, there were children watching, barefoot and wide-eyed, native to the nearby villages, who grew up playing in shadowed courtyards and drinking from fountains carved 2 millennia ago, who whispered to statues and dared one another to enter tombs after dusk. And one such child, a girl named Isabella, claimed she spoke with the dead. They dismissed her at first, as children often are. Her mother blamed sunstroke. Her brothers teased her for kissing the carved lips of Apollo's statue. But the guides who worked the site began to notice that she always knew where to go, that she found doors buried beneath ivy, that she pointed to unmarked stones and said, "There is someone sleeping here." And more often than not, she was right. An old groundskeeper began following her from a distance, recording each place she lingered, each step she took, and decades later, his notes would guide a dig that uncovered a forgotten garden, complete with a fish pond still lined with shimmering tiles and the calcified remains of 2 slaves locked in embrace. And when asked how she knew, Isabella only smiled and said, "The city told me." By the time she was 16, foreign scholars came not just to tour but to meet her. This girl with dark eyes and a voice like falling water, who could recite verses etched into broken bricks and knew the names of gods no longer worshipped. Some believed she was a reincarnation of a priestess. Others believed she had inherited Pompeii's memory, not through magic, but through blood, through bone, through the silent language of place. For what is a city, if not a soul with 1,000 mouths? Pompeii whispered through cracks in stone, through the dust that settled on museum glass, through the dreams of those who walked its silent halls. And Isabella was merely the first of many who heard it, for the children of ash were not just the ones who died in fire, but the ones who lived in shadow. In the 20th century, as the world reeled from new kinds of death, from trenches, from gas, from bombs dropped from silent skies, Pompeii became something different, a symbol not of decadence, as early Christians had claimed, nor of punishment, as firebrand priests still warned, but of mourning, of the universal truth that all cities fall, all families end, and that what remains is not ruin, but remembrance. When war came to Italy, soldiers camped beside the ruins, lighting cigarettes atop broken walls, unaware that beneath their feet lay another generation of the lost. And a British lieutenant named Thomas Cooper, an amateur painter with eyes hollowed by the fields of France, spent a night inside the old amphitheater under a tarp of stars, writing in his journal, "This place knows silence. Ours is new, theirs is old, but it is the same." After the war, tourism returned, busier than ever, and Pompeii became a theater once more, but now the stage was memory, and the actors were echoes. Guides led crowds past plaster bodies and joked in rehearsed lines. But behind the rehearsals, the ghosts remained patient, and in quiet corners, under fading frescoes, visitors sometimes wept without knowing why. In 1963, the remains of a Roman guard were discovered near the Herculaneum gate, still in uniform, sword at his side, standing upright as though he had chosen duty over escape, and schoolchildren from Naples wrote poems in his honor, taped them to his glass case, calling him Il Silenzioso, the Silent One, and leaving flowers beside his feet. His image, cast in plaster, traveled across Europe, exhibited in cathedrals and embassies, where onlookers stared into his empty face and saw something familiar: the unyielding posture of those who had faced the end and stood their ground. In modern times, as the ruins grew more fragile and technology more precise, the archaeologists changed. They came with drones and tablets, with laser scanners and 3D printers, mapping Pompeii not just as a place, but as a wound, an open history, stitched into code. And yet, for all their data, they could not chart the silence, could not digitize the stillness that settled in the House of the Faun after dusk, or the hush that gathered around the fig tree growing in what was once a kitchen garden, or the breathless awe in a child's eyes when she pressed her hand against the cold stone where another child had once drawn figures in charcoal, a cat, a ship, a name, Sylvanus. That drawing still exists, faint but defiant, a final gesture of play before the world turned to ash, and every guide who passes it slows their voice, allowing silence to complete the story. One woman, a restoration specialist named Helena, spent 20 years preserving that wall. She never married, never left Campania, and when she died, her ashes were scattered along the garden wall beside it, a final act of belonging, and perhaps that is what Pompeii became, not a ruin, not a relic, but a memory so powerful it began to remember back. Its silence was never emptiness, but a listening, a deep, attentive presence that gave shape to grief and purpose to those who lingered long enough to feel it. The gods no longer answered from marble pedestals, but from the cracks in the plaster, from the curling vines, from the way the sun lit the street of tombs in golden hush each morning. The last witnesses were never just the ones who died, but the ones who lived and who chose, day after day, year after year, to walk its stone arteries, not with dread, but with reverence, to sit where children once laughed, to kneel where incense once burned, to breathe deeply and say not goodbye, but still here. Pompeii was never gone. It was only listening, and in the hush between footfalls, in the sigh before sleep, it spoke again. And now the city sleeps once more, beneath ash, beneath stone, beneath time itself, but its voices still linger, in the walls, in the gardens, in the hearts of those who remember. You've heard its last breath, and now, as your own breath slows, let it carry you gently into dreams. The mountain is quiet again, and Pompeii still speaks. If this story brought you peace, if its echo stirred something within you, stay with us. There are more voices waiting, more lost worlds to uncover. Like, share, and follow the whisper, and together we'll remember. If you enjoy these stories, please subscribe my channel to support future episodes. In the hush that follows catastrophe, in the centuries that press forward like waves over buried stone, something strange lingers, a breath, a shadow, a name half remembered by the wind. And so it is with Pompeii, the city that would not die. Not truly, not entirely, not while there were those who dreamed of it, walked its quiet bones, or spoke its name with reverence or fear. Though the fire had silenced its heart, though ash had smothered its breath, though time had worn its memory into dust and fracture, the city stirred still beneath the touch of eyes and fingers and questions, each generation reaching into the past not to own it, but to be held by it, to feel something ancient reach back. And thus Pompeii endured not in empire or marble, but in something far more fragile and more eternal: story, echo, longing, and remembrance, the very breath of those who refused to forget. It began with artists and archaeologists, yes, with pickaxes and parchment, and the dust-caked faces of men kneeling beside frescoes they did not yet understand. But it continued with those who wandered through the ruins, not to measure, but to listen, travelers from far kingdoms and forgotten hamlets who stepped between the cracked pillars with shoes too modern for the stone, yet hearts soft enough to hear the voices embedded in the walls. There, in the courtyard of a once proud domus, a woman from Prague stood in silence before a mosaic of Neptune and Amphitrite and wept, though she did not know why. And a child from Kyoto traced the outline of a marble basin once filled with water and laughter and olive oil, whispering stories to the stones with a solemnity beyond his years, as though memory had woven itself into his skin. The city did not care who came, only that they came, that they felt, that they let the past pour through them like wind through a broken doorway. And thus Pompeii grew not in size but in soul, its spirit fed by the reverent and the curious alike, by the scent of old incense, remembered in cracked Leraria, by the echo of sandals imagined across the paving stones, by lovers who stood in the garden of the house of the Veti and kissed beneath the restored vine trellis where once laughter had rung before the ash fell. And it was this, not preservation, not excavation, that brought the city back to breath, that kept it from vanishing entirely. For though the volcano had sealed its fate in minutes, it was the living who gave it voice across millennia. The schoolchild reciting Latin lines beside the forum, the filmmaker capturing the stillness of a fresco with trembling hands, the composer who listened to the silence of the temple of Isis and wrote a requiem so gentle the sparrows paused to hear it, all of them weaving Pompeii into the fabric of the now, not as a relic but as a rhythm, and so the centuries unspooled like thread from the spindle of the fates, and Pompeii passed from ruin to relic to revelation, shaped not only by ash and time, but by those who dared to imagine what once was in Techarians, with oil lamps scouring tunnels beneath collapsed atriums, pilgrims tracing the fire-carved scars along cracked walls, painters setting easels in the silence of abandoned gardens, to capture the morning light slanting over forgotten altars where once prayers had floated on incense smoke. In 1748, when the first real breath of rediscovery unfurled from beneath the soil, when tools struck marble and the first fragments of statuary emerged blinking into the sun, a gasp rippled not only through Europe but through time itself, as if the city had exhaled once more, declaring, "I am still here," and with every coin unearthed. Every fresco coaxed into color, every amphora lifted from volcanic embrace. Pompeii's voice grew louder, not desperate, but dignified, a murmur rising to a chant in the hands of those who sought not treasure, but truth. Among them was Elisabetta Rinaldi, a woman archaeologist from Naples who spent 3 decades cataloging lost names scratched in charcoal on tavern walls, speaking each aloud as she uncovered them. Lucius, Menasha, Celer, Gayand, in doing so resurrected a city, not of emperors or legends, but of ordinary people who laughed and wept and loved and died beneath the same sky that now sheltered tourists and scholars and ghosts alike. And as the pathways cleared and the shadows lifted, the city showed itself as it had been, not perfect, not pristine, but living and lived in, full of quarrels and festivals and debts and dreams, a mirror not only of Rome but of every place that ever thought itself safe beneath the sun. And now Pompeii taught, not in the voice of ruins, but in the breathless hush of the observer who realized, standing before the ashen cast of a child curled beside his dog, that the line between then and now was paper-thin. ChatGPT said, and the world, once it heard that whisper through dust and stone, could not look away for, in that terrible beauty, in that moment caught between death and eternity. Pompeii offered something no other ruin could, not the grandeur of conquest, nor the triumph of empire, but the still beating pulse of life at its most vulnerable, preserved in the instant it was torn away. And so poets came with notebooks, their verses etched with the ache of vanished laughter, and filmmakers set up cranes above collapsed atriums, capturing the sun through latticework, vines that had not grown for millennia, and curators encased fig-shaped loaves of bread blackened by fire as if they were holy relics, and even schoolchildren, wide-eyed and shuffling through the forum in their matching caps, fell quiet before the casts, the frozen agony of men, women, animals that revealed not horror alone, but a dignity in their stillness, a reminder that these had been lives mid-motion, cut not by cruelty, but by a world they thought they understood. And in this way, Pompeii did more than survive it, became part of the world's shared dreaming, stitched into paintings by Turner, operas by Puccini, novels by Bulwer-Lytton and beyond, each adding another layer to the city's second skin, until it was no longer just an archaeological site, but a myth made visible, a memory you could walk through, touch, inhale. And though time wore at its walls, though tourists trampled its thresholds, and rain slowly unstitched its mosaics, the city endured because it had found its immortality not in perfection, but in exposure, its cracks, its wounds, its naked, final breath that let each visitor carry something home, a glimpse, a feeling, a question, as though Pompeii had pressed its story into them like a seal into wax, saying, not remember me, but feel what it is to live and to lose, and still to be known. In modern times, even as digital lights flickered across museum displays and satellites hovered far above the sleeping mountain, Pompeii continued to breathe quietly, persistently, through the careful hands of conservators, restoring fallen frescoes with the gentleness of midwives, through the voices of guides who told stories not from textbooks but from their grandmothers' memories of Neapolitan songs and whispered folk legends, through the students who set up tripods in twilight to photograph the empty streets in golden. Our silence, as though catching the breath between heartbeats. It lived in the algorithms that reconstructed collapsed villas in virtual space, in the sound engineers who recorded the wind slipping through porticos and laid it beneath orchestral scores, in the archaeobotanists who sifted charred seeds from villa gardens and replanted them in test plots to grow again what was once lost. And among these stewards of the past walked the dreamers tourists, who touched the stone with trembling fingers as though seeking echoes. Descendants who claimed distant lineage from freedmen long since turned to shadow, and even skeptics who came expecting dust and found instead the weight of story pressing gently against their ribs. And Pompeii embraced them all, for it had no need of faith or disbelief, it simply was, existing across thresholds and centuries, a city caught not in death but in becoming, reshaping itself in each eye that beheld it, in each voice that dared to speak its name with awe. It was in this way that the city reached into homes across oceans, its mosaics glowing on screens, its casts projected in classrooms, its gardens rebuilt in ceramic and sunlight across far continents. Each fragment, each whisper, a seed carried by time's wind, taking root in minds and hearts until Pompeii became not a ruin in Italy, but a mirror within humanity itself, reflecting not only our fragility, but our fierce, enduring need to remember. And in the hush of night, when the last footsteps had faded and moonlight bathed the colonnades in silver, Pompeii dreamed again of it. Laughter in the baths of sandals on stone, of prayers rising with incense beneath marble gods, now headless but not forgotten. And somewhere a breeze stirred dust in the house of the faun, lifting it like breath, as if the city sighed through time itself, whispering not farewell, but still here, still speaking, still felt. For though the fire had come and silence had fallen, Pompeii had never truly died, had simply waited, quiet beneath the ash, to be remembered. Before the mountain tore open the sky and poured death upon Pompeii, a hush lingered over the coast of Herculaneum, a town smaller and wealthier, cradled by the sea, built not upon spectacle like its neighbor, but upon serenity, its terraces and baths carved into the cliffside, its streets winding with quiet grace through colonnaded villas, sunlit courtyards, and fragrant gardens, where philosophers debated beneath fig trees and noblewomen bathed in pools of rosewater. It was a place that knew the sea as a friend, its salt air mingling with the scent of pine and oil from amphorae stacked along the docks, where fishermen hauled their nets in the pre-dawn mist, and ships from Alexandria and Massilia dropped anchor with foreign silks and spices. Herculaneum was not unaware of the tremors that had shaken the region in recent days. Priests had murmured. The earth had shifted, but the people there believed themselves safer, for the sea had always been their shield, and the mountain, though visible, seemed distant and mute, its flanks cloaked in vineyards and orchards, no different than any other god in stone. In the villa of the Papyri, a young scholar named Marcus read Epicurus aloud to his ailing teacher, the old philosopher reclining in the cool shade of a peristyle garden, unaware that the scrolls they handled, dry and brittle, copied by hand from Athens, would be reduced to carbon in a matter of hours. In the marble baths of the suburban Thermae, steam drifted through mosaic halls, and laughter echoed in vaulted chambers where senators soaked beside freedmen, their differences dissolved in mineral water as musicians plucked soft notes on the lyre. At the dockside stalls, a boy named Sagalot, 4 dried figs, his sandals leaving tiny prints in dust that would never be swept again, while his mother waited beside their donkey cart, glancing uneasily toward the mountain just as the first hiss escaped its throat. Unlike Pompeii, which was buried over many hours, Herculaneum met its end in moments when the pyroclastic surges came. They came fast and merciless, roaring down the slope in black avalanches, hotter than fire, faster than galloping horses, incinerating what they touched and sucking the air from lungs before a scream could form. The sea, once a haven, boiled in its harbor, sending steam spiraling into the sky, while along the arched boathouses that lined the beach, hundreds of people, slaves, women, children, sailors, sheltered in desperation, clutching one another, whispering prayers to Neptune or Jupiter or anyone listening. The first wave entombed them where they crouched, fusing bone to stone, freezing agony in a final, breathless embrace. Those who had fled inland fared no better. Their bodies, later, found in alleyways and doorways, their limbs contorted, their faces turned toward a sky they never saw again. And yet, even in death, Herculaneum did not vanish entirely. For unlike Pompeii, where air and ash destroyed much, the surges at Herculaneum preserved, seared, and sealed, turning wood to charcoal, scrolls to blackened spirals, fabrics too fragile, silhouettes that still retained the folds of their last movements. In the silence that followed, the sea reclaimed the coast, and the city disappeared beneath 60 feet of volcanic material, its name fading from memory, its fate forgotten while empires rose and fell. Asterisk, centuries passed as if drawn across glass, the dust and silence settling like a second skin over Herculaneum, sealing it deeper than Pompeii, locking its secrets under layers of tufa and stone, so deep that even rumor struggled to reach it. While travelers spoke of the ghost city inland, where statues peeked from ash, no one remembered the wealthier sister that had vanished along the coast. No songs sung, no legends told until the 18th century, when a peasant digging a well struck marble, not earth, and the bones of the forgotten city shuddered awake beneath his feet, revealing columns and coins, walls of astonishing paint that had not faded, and villas so pristine they looked as if their owners might return at any moment to sip wine in the porticos. The Bourbon kings, more interested in treasure than history, tunneled through the dark with torches and greed, chiseling out frescoes for their palaces, not realizing they were vandalizing a time capsule untouched by air since the day Vesuvius had swallowed it whole. Yet even amid their plunder, what they uncovered defied belief. Mosaics, so detailed that the individual scales of a fish shimmered as if still wet, wooden furniture charred but intact, beams, beds, and doors so perfectly preserved that termites, had they lived, could have returned to finish their work. And then there were the scrolls, the carbonized remains of the only known ancient library to survive antiquity, not in parchment or ink, but blackened coils like fossilized thought, hundreds of them locked in brittle spirals of soot in the villa once owned by Lucius Calpurnius Piso, father-in-law to Julius Caesar himself. These were not legends. They were people. Their gods, their meals, their arguments over politics or poetry were frozen, not in myth, but in mundane moments. A comb left on a dresser, a loaf of bread fused to a platter, a dog chained too short to escape. And perhaps that is what struck those who descended into the black shafts first, not grandeur, but intimacy. Herculaneum had not been mythologized like Atlantis or Troy. It had been hidden in silence, unromantic and unremembered, until the pickaxes and lanterns unearthed a world too real to deny. And as the archaeologists grew more careful, more reverent, they realized the city was not just a twin to Pompeii, but a different reflection, entirely more elegant, more affluent, better preserved. Its people more literate, its walls covered, not in slogans or jokes, but in poetry and philosophy. If Pompeii showed how Romans lived in the street, Herculaneum revealed how they lived in the soul. Every inch spoke of refinement. Bronze fittings on doors, marble thresholds, baths with private heating systems, and art everywhere, not for power, but for pleasure. In one home, a mosaic of Neptune and Amphitrite shimmered beside a private bath. In another, a sculpture of Hercules, drunk, slumped in comic debauchery, leaned in a garden alcove. Even the latrines had carved decoration, their polished seats and tiled drainage showing the Roman obsession with comfort and hygiene. These were not ruins. They were memories caught mid-breath, and with each discovery, the silence cracked a little more. Yet for all its elegance and preservation, the soul of Herculaneum was not found in its villas or scrolls, but in the quiet agony of its final moments, recorded not in words, but in flesh, turned to shadow the seared outlines of human forms, huddled in the stone boathouses by the sea. A gallery of death painted in volcanic ash, where mothers clutched infants to their chests, where lovers embraced, where soldiers and sailors tried vainly to cover their mouths from the toxic wind that came not from sea or storm, but from the depths of the earth itself. Over 300 skeletons would one day be uncovered there, their bones twisted in final motion, their skulls shattered by heat so intense it boiled brains into vapor, leaving behind a story far too real to mythologize. Among them was a woman, with a silver mirror still clutched in her hand, its frame warped but intact, as if in that last moment she had looked to her reflection, hoping to anchor herself to life, to memory, to a face the gods might spare. A child was found curled into the ribs of a man, perhaps her father, perhaps a stranger. Their arms formed a circle even as fire took them. And most haunting of all were the mariners, the naval men, who had come too late from Misenum, their ships, tossed by boiling surf, their mission noble but doomed, commanded by the very admiral whose nephew would one day record the catastrophe for posterity, Pliny the Younger, whose letters to Tacitus would survive longer than any sculpture or wall. His uncle, Pliny the Elder, had taken to the sea with courage, seeking to rescue those along the coast, but the skies rained ash, and the sea turned against him. The ships could not land. The admiral's last sight of Herculaneum was not of rooftops or mosaics, but of flame climbing skyward in great columns, and of people trapped at the edge of the world, begging not for mercy, but for time. In the decades and centuries that followed, Herculaneum would become a city that whispered, not shouted, overshadowed by its more famous sibling. It remained in shadow, more intact but less understood, its story found not in tragedy carved into amphitheaters, but in fragments of papyrus, in the stillness of doorways, in the silence of rooms where no one ever left. And now, as we walk the quiet corridors of Herculaneum, where the sea sighs beyond resurrected columns and shadows linger in frescoed rooms. We are not just visitors, we are witnesses, listening to the voices pressed into stone and ash, hearing in every mosaic and charred doorway the last heartbeat of a world lost not in conquest, but in silence. And as sleep drapes gently over you now, remember that beneath every stone, every ruin, a story waits not just of death, but of the fragile, enduring breath of life that once was, and still whispers, from beneath the ash. It began not with a trumpet, but with a whisper centuries after Rome had fallen in the west. Her eastern twin still rose in splendor above the Bosporus, a city of mosaics and marble, where domes caught the sun like shields of the divine, and the golden sea walls of Constantinople shimmered with the power of 1,000 years of endurance. Byzantium, the city of cities, throne of emperors and guardian of relics, still held the illusion of Rome's unbroken line, its streets thick with incense, its libraries filled with Greek fire and forgotten texts, its churches ringing with hymns in a tongue older than Latin, and yet, behind the silks and sanctity, cracks had deepened. Emperors, blinded by palace intrigue, generals turned mercenaries, and borders retreating under the breath of enemies who no longer wore togas or spoke of Caesar. Still it endured, proud and defiant, until the winds of the west, stirred by piety and gold, set their sails eastward with crusader banners flapping above greed-cloaked righteousness. The Fourth Crusade, born of holy oath and Venetian ambition, veered not toward Jerusalem, but to Constantinople, lured by a young, exiled prince named Alexios Angelos, who promised silver, soldiers, and submission to Rome if they restored him to his father's throne. Venice, the serpent of the Adriatic, whose merchant fleets thirsted for control of the seas, agreed not for God, but for commerce, and so knights and nobles, hardened by past crusades and seduced by the myth of the imperial East, boarded ships, not to free the Holy Land, but to betray a Christian city. As the ships breached the Sea of Marmara in 1203, their crimson crosses gleaming in sunlight, the citizens of Constantinople lined the walls in disbelief, watching Christian war banners rise against a city of Christian faithful. The Latins came, not with sermons, but with siege towers and fire, and the city shuddered beneath the horror of brother turned against brother. Inside the palace, old Emperor Isaac II, restored by the invaders and now half-blind and weak, watched his son Alexios IV, the promised benefactor, failed to uphold his bargain, for the treasury was empty and the people grew furious. The streets burned with riots, monks cursed from the pulpit, and the fragile alliance collapsed. Alexios was strangled by his own guards. A new usurper rose, Alexios V. Dukazian, proud and ready to repel the Latins. But the die had been cast, and vengeance had fomented, and so, in April of 1204, the unthinkable happened. On the morning of the 12th, with mists rising from the horn like smoke from old wounds, the ships of Venice surged forward, their hulls hammering the sea walls, their men screaming Deus Vult, as if God would bless what came next. Latin steel tore through Eastern hearts. Crusader blades hacked open gates built by Constantine's architects, and the greatest city in Christendom fell not to Muslim swords, but to Christian ones. For 3 days and nights the city was raped and looted, churches stripped, icons shattered, relics stolen, the tomb of Justinian violated, the libraries torched, the Hagia Sophia desecrated as soldiers slaughtered beneath the mosaics of Christ Pantocrator. Horses were stabled in the altars. Nuns were dragged from their cloisters. Priests were murdered in the nave. Gold mosaics were peeled from walls and melted into coins. Statues of ancient emperors were broken for sport. Latin knights, their armor, still wet with the blood of Orthodox faithful, drank from chalices stolen from the altar of St. John Chrysostom. 1,000 years of culture, of memory, of sacred continuity, was erased in a heartbeat of war and greed. The population fled in terror, families torn apart in the smoke, children lost in alleys, the old strangled by fire and collapse. Those who hid in monasteries were not spared. Those who surrendered were not forgiven. The city, untouched for 9 centuries, violated by none, even in times of plague and siege, now lay in ruin at the hands of those who claimed the same cross. Venice took its prize bronze horses from the hippodrome, gold by the ton, books that would vanish into private collections. The Latin Empire of Constantinople was proclaimed a poor shadow of Byzantium, its rulers wearing crowns over ashes. But no Western king could wield the Roman legacy they had burned. What they won in gold, they lost in honor. And in that moment, something old died, not just a city, but a continuity stretching from Augustus to Theodora, from Justinian to Anna Comnene. The flame sputtered, but did not go out, for in the hills of Nicaea and Epirus, Byzantine exiles gathered the last embers of their world. And so it was that out of the smoldering husk of Constantinople's corpse, there arose not silence, but defiance among the broken. Among those exiled to the winds, memory became a weapon sharper than Latin blades. And the soul of Byzantium scattered to Nicaea, to Trebizond, to Epirus, where surviving nobles, priests, generals, and peasants carried with them relics and rage, binding the wounds of a shattered empire, not with stone, but with stubborn hope. In the West, the Latin Empire was born a brittle mockery of the Eastern Roman crown, cobbled from greed and maintained through foreign arms and debt, with Latin lords squabbling over crumbling provinces, while the sacred traditions of the East were exiled to borderlands, burning now not incense, but longing. The real Byzantium lived in exile, its pulse flickering in the makeshift court of Nicaea, where Emperor Theodore I, Lascaris once a courtier, now a defiant sovereign, gathered the remnants of scholars and strategists and vowed to reclaim the city that had once crowned emperors and saints. His was an empire of grit, not grandeur, where forgotten generals trained sons in monastery courtyards, and monks copied scriptures by candlelight in mountain caves, sheltering the last flames of a world almost extinguished. In Trebizond, the Grand Komnenoi ruled a splinter kingdom, while in Epirus, Greek warlords forged uneasy alliances with Latin barons and Turkish beys, each clawing at the bones of the old empire. Meanwhile, Constantinople, under its Latin rulers, rotted from within. Its mosaics wept black with mold. Its churches sat half empty, its markets echoing with foreign tongues and silent ghosts. The relics of saints vanished to French cathedrals and Venetian vaults, the treasures of Hagia Sophia sold to fund mercenaries, while her dome wept beneath the weight of an alien priesthood. But memory is a patient tide, and Byzantium was never merely stone and gold. It was a language, a rite, a breath passed from mother to child, from monk to pupil, from elder to orphan. It was the murmur of Greek psalms under Latin banners, the refusal to forget even as forgetting seemed safer. And then, 57 years after the sack, in the blackness before dawn, on a July night in 1261, the exiles returned, not with legions, but with cunning. Michael VIII Palaeologos, emperor of the Nicene Refuge, had forged the impossible diplomatic web of alliances, bribes, and betrayals, and a pact with the Genoese to undermine Venetian control of the Bosporus. While the Latin Empire weakened, exhausted, and underdefended, Michael sent General Alexios Strategopoulos to scout the city. What he found changed history. The Latin garrison had departed on campaign, and Constantinople lay exposed like a wound unguarded. Under moonlight, Strategopoulos and a handful of soldiers entered through a hidden postern gate, crept through abandoned alleys, and opened the walls from within. By dawn, the banners of the cross and double-headed eagle flew again above the Hagia Sophia. The Latins, roused from sleep, fled in chaos to their ships. After nearly 6 decades in exile, the Romans had returned not in triumph but in survival. Michael VIII entered the city days later, barefoot, weeping, kneeling before the shattered altar of the great church, promising to restore what had been desecrated. The city, he reclaimed, was not the jewel his ancestors had ruled. It was broken, haunted, hollowed by fire and theft. But it was still Constantinople. And in that truth, Byzantium rose against Card, reduced, weary, but breathing. For nearly 2 more centuries, the empire would endure, no longer the master of empires, but the guardian of memory. An anachronism in a world grown cold and new. It would battle Turks, Venetians, Bulgars, and time itself, ruled by emperors who carried titles heavier than their armies, cloaked in robes sewn with threadbare dignity. In palaces with leaking roofs, they debated theology as the Ottomans built canon. In monasteries, lit by flickering oil, monks debated the filioque while the streets outside echoed with foreign boots. But still, they remembered. They remembered what had been, and in that there was victory. Thus ends the tale of the Crusaders and the city they were sworn to protect but chose to plunder. A wound in Christendom deeper than any heathen conquest. A betrayal that echoes louder than victory. A moment when the Latin cross shattered against the golden horn, not from Muslim swords, but from the pride and greed of those who believed themselves holy. As you drift now into sleep, let the bells of the Hagia Sophia ring gently in your dreams, not in triumph, but in mourning, not in rage, but in remembrance. For history does not sleep. It lingers, it murmurs, it breathes in even the ashes of empires. Remember the flames that consumed them. And now the city sleeps once more, beneath ash, beneath stone, beneath time itself. But its voices still linger, in the walls, in the gardens, in the hearts of those who remember. You've heard its last breath, and now, as your own breath slows, let it carry you gently into dreams. The mountain is quiet again, and Pompeii still speaks. If this story brought you peace, if its echo stirred something within you, stay with us. There are more voices waiting, more lost worlds to uncover. Like, share, and follow the whisper, and together we'll remember. If you enjoy these stories, please subscribe my channel to support future episodes.